Hello and welcome back to the Economist Impact Sustainability Week countdown to COP27. My name is Daniel Block, Assistant Manager for Sustainable Aviation Fuel at IATA, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to four wonderful panelists that's going to be covering what is one of the hottest topics in the aviation industry at the moment, and that is developing better biofuels. Today, we've got four panelists across a range of different stakeholders, and I'd like to introduce you to them now. Starting with Dr. Valerie Sarisky-Reed, Director of Bioenergy Technology from the Department of Energy in the USA. Lee Hudson, Sustainable Fuel and Carbon Manager for International Airlines Group. Sarah Wilkin, Founder and CEO of the Fly Green Alliance. And Rachel Delhayes, the Head of Sustainability from Convex Insurance. It's a pleasure to have you all today discussing what is a very, very profound and important topic for the airline industry. And I'd like to start the conversation with a question to you, Dr. Reed. The USA and the government of the Department of Energy has recently released a SAF roadmap as part of this grand challenge set by the Biden administration. I'd love for you to elaborate on this and how that links to develop.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me here to just, take a few minutes to share the U.S. approach to global decarbonization of our economy. In the United States, we are instituting a whole of government approach to cutting our emissions in half by the end of the decade and reach net zero emissions by 2050. And of course, aviation is a sector we need to focus on, and it's really important. Thank you for mentioning. It was just over 1 year ago that our three agencies that lead this, that is our Department of Transportation, USDA, and Department of Energy, kicked off what is called the Sustainable Aviation Fuels Grand Challenge. And this was really meant to motivate both government and industry to come together to rally around increasing biofuels and better biofuels to produce 3 billion gallons of sustainable aviation fuel by 2030. That's a 20% reduction in greenhouse gases with today's available SAF. And then the final destination, of course, is to get 100% aviation fuel needs met by 2050 from sustainable aviation fuels. Well, we started work immediately, brought together many groups from both academia, our national labs, and several groups related to various aspects of the industry. And just last week in Pittsburgh, we released our Sustainable Aviation Fuel Grand Challenge Roadmap. So this roadmap identifies those priority areas that we really need to focus on. Their feedstock, conversion technologies, end use, infrastructure, and policy are just to name a few of the areas that the roadmap is going to highlight. Most importantly, though, beyond the document itself, is the fact that it really champions collaboration. It was the result of collaboration. It aligns government actions across many agencies to coordinate our activities the best we can in order to help meet the aviation industry's needs, help fuel producers scale up their technologies, bring more and readily available feedstocks to market, and help deploy all of this at scale. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Reed, for that really interesting insight. Obviously, there's a huge amount of momentum in the bioenergy space over in the USA. We've also recently seen the passing of the Inflation Reduction Act. Would you mind just touching a little bit upon the positive impact that's going to have on SAF production ramp up?
No, very happy to. That is what I call the third tier. The third tier we needed out of three to really make this happen. Their three levers include technology readiness. And for decades, the USA and others have been working on making these fuels viable, building up technology pathways that work and at costs that are reasonable. The second, of course, tier is market pull. And we have seen a historic interest in the market for biofuels in general, but sustainable aviation fuels specifically. And then the third, of course, is strong policies. And again, another historic first, both the bipartisan infrastructure language and the Inflation Reduction Act were signed by our legislation, to really put dollars where we need them to go to support our decarbonization goals. And associated particularly with sustainable aviation fuels, there is a 2-year blender's tax credit, which will help those who blend SAF at 50% or greater GHG over petroleum. And then there is a 3-year tax incentive to help in the overall production of sustainable aviation fuel. And of course, there's also some grant programs, one of which $290 million was dedicated to projects that will really help the production, transport, blending, and storage of sustainable aviation fuel, because we need all of that infrastructure if we're going to make this new industry a reality.
Thank you, Dr. Reed. Moving on to Lee Hudson from International Airlines Group. Lee, you're obviously at the head of one of the largest airline groups in the world and the sustainability strategy there. Can you touch upon how your group has approached SAF agreements and as well investments? There's obviously a mountain of different factors that must be taken into account. Can you please allude to some of these?
Sure. I mean, we've been working on SAF for well over a decade, and really applaud the fantastic work that's been happening in the US, because we've seen a huge amount of progress because of the investment the US has made, particularly in things like fuel testing in the early years, without which we wouldn't have a SAF industry at all. So as a global airline, we really need a diverse approach to both the types of feedstock we look for, the technologies we pursue, and we've got about 15 projects currently at different stages of development. And as a global airline group, we pick up fuel all over the place. So we're mainly focusing our efforts at the moment in the UK, the EU, and in the US, because that's where the developing policy is and the support programs. We have a target in the group to have 10% SAF by 2030, which is about 1 million tonnes, so no small feat. And we're working hard to secure that volume, and we're doing that through a range of different partnerships. And again, I want to just say collaboration is key. We have a range of investments. We're sometimes providing equity or debt to projects. We fund development, and we also provide firm offtake agreements, which is one of the key roles that airlines like us can play. And we've been prioritising our efforts on waste and residues, because a lot of projects, the main cost of production comes from the actual feedstock cost. So if we can exploit lower value waste and residues to make SAF, over the longer term, we should be able to produce more cost competitive SAF. So everything from forestry residues, agricultural residues to garbage. We have projects across a whole spectrum of different technologies and feedstocks. The key thing is that we have to be able to measure that they're sustainable, and that's something we won't compromise on. We can be flexible on everything else, but the sustainability deliverables are first and foremost for us in working out what we spend our time and invest in.
And that really is a critical piece, I think, that you're touching upon there, Lee, the notion that we can't compromise on the emission reduction factor of the feedstocks that we're utilising. Are you seeing this coming through from your customer base as well?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, we're working with a number of our corporate customers, and we also offer SAF to retail customers through our standalone website. So we've been offering offsets since the early 2000s, and we've just started offering SAF as a standard product. And particularly for corporate customers, they really want to see a lot of evidence and data on where's that feedstock come from, what's the chain of custody, what are the greenhouse gas savings. Feedstock is obviously a really important aspect of making sure that feedstock is sourced sustainably. And we work with the Roundtable on Sustainable Biomaterials and other sustainability certifiers to make sure we can evidence all of that to customers and assure them that we know right the way through from where the feedstocks originates from. So we've got a supply in the UK through Phillips 66. They are supplying us waste cooking oil, SAF, into Heathrow, and some of that feedstock, I was looking at the list the other day, comes from places just around the factory, actually, in Teesside. So if you're having fish and chips or going to the pub in that part of the UK, some of that stuff is going through to the SAF that we are that they are manufacturing and supplying to us. So yeah, I mean, we can't always get it as locally as that, but sometimes it works out. So yeah, evidence on sustainability really, really important. And as we start to scale up, I think it's really important that we get better structures to track it and provide that evidence. It should be a routine thing for customers and for us to be able to show that. And it's still a work in progress, I think, with us to build those systems to show that evidence to customers.
Thanks for that, Lee. It's quite funny to think that when consuming my fish and chips on the weekend, that I'm doing my bit for energy transition in the airline industry. Just transitioning now to Sarah. Sarah, the Fly Green Alliance, which you founded a few years ago, has obviously seen quite a notable shift in the energy transition landscape, even in such a short space of time. Do you want to reflect upon how you've seen that transition take place and the emerging mindsets that we can see in the priorities that have emerged in this time as well?
Yeah, for sure, Daniel. So yeah, I founded Fly Green Alliance a few years ago in 2019 because I worked with the University of Amsterdam, and we worked together because the professor Shiji Ravindran is working on a project that can turn waste into aviation fuel. So we actually were fortunate enough to get a Booking.com grant December 2018 to work on that research project. And I think it was what I realized, I think it was the first time outside of the aviation industry that actually travel had taken kind of noticed sustainable aviation fuel and were giving it some visibility. So I think that was a bit of a milestone a few people had mentioned to me, because I was back. Then I was going to Brussels a lot in 2019 to understand policy, what is SAF, who's working on it. And I met Lee and I met several airlines and airports, and they were really saying, yes, it's important, we do want it. But then the topic of the price was always coming up and that it was too expensive. So that kind of got my cogs spinning, and it kind of and then I realized that, if, as Lee said, if we really want to get things moving, collaboration is key. So then I set up, I believe we may be one of the first alliances to bring stakeholders together to work on scaling sustainable aviation fuel, and also bringing new stakeholders into the group, for example, business, travel, sports. And really it was about, I set things up to kind of bring stimulation, bring awareness, and bring information to people, and to really start thinking about how to reduce that price or share the price. So yeah, that was a few years ago now, and yeah, as you were asking, Daniel, things have changed a lot. Of course, the grounding of aviation has affected things, but what it did do was ensure that the airlines want to build back better and go for green recovery.
Sarah, you were mentioning that through the Fly Green Alliance, you obviously are dealing with a range of different stakeholders that have different interests in energy transition and sustainable aviation fuel. I want to specifically call out the banks and prospective investors. How do you identify this as sort of a challenge and bringing these investors and the banks along for the journey? How can we do this better as an industry?
Yeah, to be honest, when I was going to the events in Brussels, what I was seeing that everybody did want to work towards it, but actually there wasn't any investors in the room, and there wasn't as much discussion about who was going to invest in SAF. And to me, that was what was missing. And I started speaking to a lot of banks, investors, financial institutes, and at that time, nobody had really heard of sustainable aviation fuel. So I realized there was a big piece of awareness done. And actually, that brings me on to the fact that we at Fly Green Alliance, so we've created a report, which actually is we're going to publish tomorrow. And it really is just, it's kind of for investors and those that have an interest, but maybe not a lot of knowledge of sustainable aviation fuel. And it's to bring awareness and to open up the conversation for investors. So what we've actually done is the top 10 sustainable aviation fuel mechanisms, and then what the mechanisms are doing, working out how to share the cost of the fuel at the moment with corporate travellers. As Lee said, there is a lot of interest from corporate travel, because if you are working towards net zero, you're working on your scope 1, 2 and 3. Sustainable aviation fuel for an airline is scope 1, for a business traveller it's scope 3. So there's a lot of development work. As Lee mentioned as well, the Roundtable for Sustainable Biomaterials is creating a system called Book and Claim. And that means you can buy the fuel virtually, share the cost, and then what you will do is allow that fuel to enter the global supply, but be able to claim your GHG reduction through this way. So there's lots of work going on, but it's early stages, and it's developing into, we've got a unit where we can share the cost of sustainable fuel with corporate travellers, and then that unit can be put on a registry, and it can also be part of a carbon exchange. So there's lots of different pieces of work that are World Economic Forum, SABA, by Microsoft. There's lots of different organizations now coming into the sector because they're seeing sustainable aviation as a global topic, which I also think it is.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Sarah. Very much looking forward to that report coming out as well. Moving on to Rachel. And Rachel, the question we'd like to pose at this point in time is, can you explain why sustainable aviation is of importance to an insurer such as Convex?
Sure. So, like many firms, as we look to our supply chain, we're keen to understand the sustainability profile of the airlines and manufacturers and airports that we insure. And as transparency around investors and insurers' financed emissions grows, it's in our interest to engage in the net zero strategies, particularly in harder to abate sectors. So we're keen to understand and build aviation decarbonisation into our own net zero approach and transition risk management. And SAF, sustainable aviation fuel, is the most material solution to aviation decarbonisation in the short to medium term, but it requires significant scaling. So as a key financial partner, it makes sense for insurers to also consider investing in SAF and also encouraging the awareness and understanding of the need for this scaling, just as Sarah was alluding to. So as part of our investment, what we call our impact investment strategy, we are keen to identify transition-related technology that's both commercially interesting and progressive for the sectors that we as a commercial insurer are engaged in. And we're also active, an active user of air travel. Hence, from our own travel-related emissions, we're interested in the availability of SAF. But I guess primarily, I think it's a really exciting commercial opportunity, and it's really additive to the circular economy.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that, Rachel. And I'm going to take this opportunity now to open the discussion up to the group. And I think one of the key topics that I want to circle back to here is definitely on feedstock. We sort of recognize as this being the critical lever that we need to get right to scale up our sustainable aviation fuel, not just from a pure production perspective, but also from a better biofuel perspective. And so there's a number of different factors we have to take into account. We have to take into cost, emission reduction factor, and also regional salience. So let's start with the question: how important is diversification of our feedstock portfolio to scaling? Who would like to take this?
Sorry about that. I can start quickly. With in the U.S., we really do believe in the diversification of feedstocks because we have an industry today which is built on corn for the production of biofuels. And corn, by the way, has improved in its greenhouse gas profile from the very early days where it was 20% GHG. Today, it is in and around 50% better than petroleum. So that just gives you an indication that there's a great deal of innovation that can happen even in existing technologies. But to really move beyond those food-based feedstocks, we have done studies over the last 20 years on what we now call our billion ton of available sustainable biomass in the United States. And that includes the wastes we've already heard about. But for example, forest residues, which, by the way, create an issue for forest fires in our western part of the United States. So by utilizing those, we are actually displacing a major CO2 emitter and very dangerous activity. Municipal solid waste, get it out of the landfills and get it into our sustainable aviation fuel. And what about agricultural residues? We have great productivity in this country on our farm fields, but we can actually take those residues and we can create marketable products from those. All of these help to really reduce the overall cost of sustainable aviation fuel. They all come at a different price point. We know that. But we've been working for decades on those conversion technologies. And by bringing them up, scaling them, and getting them into the market will begin to reduce the cost and find itself a parity across the whole market, enabling the industry to grow from there.
Lee, I thought I saw your hand come up there. Was there something further that you wanted to touch upon?
So, yes, I mean, I couldn't agree more. It's critical for us to have a diverse range of feedstocks. One of my good friends calls it not the silver bullet, the silver bucket. So there's as well as the sort of solid materials that Valerie's been talking about. There's a lot of work going on to convert waste gases from industrial processes and carbon dioxide. Longer term aim to get that turned into SAF. But yeah, there's been a number of studies. The World Economic Forum has one, as well as the great aviation roadmap that the US has produced. There is Waypoint 2050. There's numerous studies out there that say there is enough. We just have to mobilize and build this new industry, and it's more revenue for farmers. You know, if they can actually get revenue from their waste and residues that can be sourced sustainably, as well as the actual feedstock. And the great thing about biomass based, and we're talking about biofuels today predominantly, is that you can also take the CO2 that's produced by the factory and store it. So you can get very, very low carbon intensity SAF through the use of sustainable biomass. As you can see, I'm a big fan that we can do this sustainably and deliver very, very strong greenhouse gas savings.
Thanks very much, Lee and Dr. Reid. Clearly, these positive externalities and stacking effects that we can get across the production chain of, be it these waste-based feedstocks, the forestry residues, there's a huge amount of excitement that's going to be coming through. And these, of course, marry up with existing pathways as well as new pathways that are going to be coming through over the next period of time in the lead up to 2030. I might also point out that I'm really buoyed by the fact that these feedstocks that you've mentioned do marry up with some of the alternative pathways that exist right now that we're not seeing as prominent in our sort of variations of our capacity forecasts. At this point in time, within IATA's readings, we see about 85% of future SAF supply coming from the heifer pathway at this point in time, which typically marry up with their used cooking oil and tallow. And whilst these can achieve solid emission reduction factors, it's important that we do cast that net a bit wider in order to reach our targets in the lead up to 2030, particularly whilst we're still in this advanced biofuel stage, and then waiting for these alternative pathways to come through. I might just segue into the next topic of sharing the cost of investment. And I'd like to open up the discussion around what are the levers that we need to pull to do so and to share these costs? Is it a public sector issue? Is it a private sector issue? What's the balance?
I'll jump in if that's all right, Daniel. I mean, from an investment point of view, so we've started doing our work with the investment sector and are speaking to banks because actually there isn't enough investment in the sector at the moment. There's a lot of new pathways. There's 9 pathways at the moment that are certified and using all sorts of different feedstocks. So we know it's there, as Lee has mentioned, but actually we're still going through an education phase with the investment sector. Some of the projects they're first of a kind projects, so they do need to be hurdled. They do need maybe a certain amount of years where they're not going to be profitable. So it's really, can a portfolio manager, can the investment sector make sure that they put it in the mix, but can they also be flexible? Maybe they're not going to have a return on investment 6 months, 18 months. It may take longer, but as Lee was also discussing, what we're now showing with the demand side work that we're doing from corporate travellers, they do want it. They are willing to share the cost. And actually, this is a really good signal to the investors. But it's as we were saying, it's still pretty nascent. But the more of the kind of BA's example, as I mentioned, we've got the top 10 mechanisms that is about cost sharing, the literal cost of the fuel. And what this is doing is showing the investor, look, people want this, the aviation industry want it, sports want it, business travel want it. Everybody is really saying we need to green our travel. We do need to travel. A lot of people do. Businesses need to travel. The airlines were bailed out by many countries. It's key to connections. So it's really, how do we bring more stakeholders such as Convex and others into the conversation? And that's what we've been doing recently. And we've been speaking to UN Environment and others, and really bringing attention to the topic. So
yeah. I think it's for financial partners to kind of put their heads together and think about where their aligned interest is. There's a good example in June of this year. There was I read that Qantas and Airbus had announced a combined investment of 200 million in SAF entities. That's a really good example of aligned interest. Mm-hmm. So whether it's the financial partners of the feedstock providers, waste management or whatever, and those financing the aviation world or with a financial interest in it, I think there's just I think there's a real demand, and I think it's so good from the circular economy perspective. It's a really it kind of everyone benefits.
Mm-hmm. I'd love to just toss one more thing in about the support for financial backing. The government's role, at least from my perspective and where we sit, is to really buy down that risk, to help get that risk as close to manageable as possible. So that is why we have invested billions of dollars in the technology that is now being scaled up, and actually supporting the scale up of that with 50% cost share. All of that to give the financial world a package that is at least as close to de-risked as we can get it on all of the new technologies.
Yeah, exactly.
And I was going to also add that that's why our first construction project is in the US, because the US has successively helped to de-risk, and I think in Europe and the UK we're seeing similar moves, but much slower, and I think we need to see that on a global basis, really, to see these developments happening all over, because airlines fly everywhere, and so we need to have this sustainable fuel solution provided across the globe, really, to be able to help us meet our net zero target. It's very challenging. So more people following the US example, we hope.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for that, Lee. I have to say that half an hour has gone quicker than a west to east transatlantic crossing with a tailwind. That has absolutely flown by. There's obviously a lot of messages to take home from that. I think the keys that we can identify here is collaboration is key, cross-sector, cross-private, public, academia, all hands on deck for this energy transition. It's iterative and it's ongoing. but we also have the at our disposal. The technology exists, and there is sufficient feedstock if we can write resources together to actively go about acquiring them and systematically collecting them in the right way. I'd like to thank our 4 panelists for their time. Dr. Reid, Sarah, Lee, and Rachel, thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure, a fascinating discussion that no doubt could have gone for many, many more hours, but we'll have to leave it there for today. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in from all around the world, and please do stay tuned for the following session.